Okay, let us now continue to go through the unemployment chapter, CSQ1 Parts C Part 1 and C Part 2. In a previous video, I actually covered parts A and B, so this is just a continuation of that video, okay? Now, C Part 1 basically requires you to provide an evaluation of the off-budget policy measures used to tackle the problem of unemployment. Okay, so as per usual, what we do is we break down the questions into our 3C's question analysis framework, and basically the command word here, although this is not a very common way of phrasing the question, basically they want you to evaluate the off-budget policy measures. Okay, so as we are already very familiar, evaluate requires you to present both sides of the argument and also eventually come to a stand. Okay, so actually I've said this, what are you supposed to evaluate? You are supposed to evaluate the off-budget policy measures. Okay, the off-budget policy measures, these are actually covered in extract 3 of the CSQ. Okay, specifically, you are supposed to tell me about the effectiveness of these off-budget policy measures in addressing structural unemployment. Okay, strictly speaking, the question did not mention structural unemployment, but hopefully by now it should be clear to you that these policy measures only address structural unemployment. Okay, so basically, what are the two sides? Then the two sides would be to explain how these policy measures will work, and the second side, which is to explain its limitations. Okay, then from there you come to a stand regarding whether these policy measures are actually effective or not. Okay, lastly, the context, okay, not immediately obvious in the question, but if you read the CSQ, it is quite clear that we are talking about the Singaporean context. So let us go to the answer proper. As with all answers, you start off with the introduction. Basically, what we expect you to do in this introduction is two things. Briefly introduce the different policy measures that are mentioned in extract 3, and also briefly mention the purpose of these policies. Okay, so if you read extract 3, the first two policy measures that they are talking about basically is training and skills upgrading programs, and also the job traineeship program. And the last paragraph of extract 3 actually talks about this skills redevelopment program. Okay, and the reason why I split up this 3 to talk about them separately is that the purpose of these policies are actually different. The first two program actually aims to equip unemployed workers with new skills to overcome the skills mismatch in the economy. Okay, however, the last one, the skills redevelopment program, actually aims to allow existing workers to upgrade their skills, okay, so that they can move on to new job scopes or new areas within that same company. Okay, now the first side of the argument, once you have completed the introduction, is to talk about how these policy measures will work to address structural unemployment. So the first two programs, which is basically acquiring new skills, what are some examples? Remember, it is always good for you to give examples, especially in CSQ answers. Okay, so when we say acquiring new skills, we are talking about skills in terms of operating new types of machinery, and also maybe to provide higher service standards. Okay, so what this does is that it increases the occupational mobility of the unemployed. Basically, the unemployed will have more opportunities to take up different jobs. Okay, so they become more mobile in terms of the jobs that they can take. So this is what we mean by increasing occupational mobility. It is easier for them to move around different jobs, and therefore it is easier for them to find a job. Okay, Eventually, this addresses the skills mismatch between the unemployed and what the job openings require. Okay, so this allows the unemployed to fit into the new job openings and therefore increase their opportunities of getting employed and therefore reducing structural unemployment. Okay, the other off-policy measure, such as the skills redevelopment program, actually aims to upgrade skills of existing workers. Okay, so these workers, they are not exactly unemployed, but they are still in their jobs, and what we are trying to do is to provide them with training while they are still in the jobs. Okay, the aim here is so that the workers can cope with new demands from their existing jobs, or if their existing jobs become redundant, they can then move on to other job scopes within the same company. Okay, so the good thing about this skills redevelopment program then is that workers will not lose their jobs when the demands change. Okay, it is easy for them to move and accommodate to the new demands, or move within the company to different job areas. Okay. Now, what are some of the limitations of these off-budget policy measures? Okay, in terms of acquiring new skills for the unemployed, the problem here is that while you are acquiring the skills, you incur time lag. Okay, and also it is not easy to acquire new skills. Okay, so what do I mean by time lag? Firstly, there are some skills who may be very specialized, and if you want to be trained in those skills, you may need maybe 6 months, a year, or even 2 years to get the necessary qualifications to show that you have acquired these skills. But the thing is, in this rapidly changing economy, the skills that you acquire may not be in demand once your 1 or 2 year training has ended. In that case, your whatever skills that you have learned, in the end it turns out to be useless. Okay. Moreover, while you are at the training, in the 1-2 years where you may be training, you still do not enjoy any income, so it may still be very difficult for the unemployed workers. Other than the time lag, there is also a lot of difficulty in terms of acquiring new skills. Okay, what do I mean? For example, a lot of workers, especially older workers, they tend to have very low educational qualifications, and some of them may not be very well versed in English, for example. So in acquiring new skills, it is often the case that you need to have a certain minimum educational standards and also a minimum level of English language ability. So it becomes difficult if you do not have basic educational qualifications, and it also is difficult for you to pick up the skills if your English language ability is limited. Okay. Apart from that, this may be a stereotype, but older people tend to be more resistant towards learning, and also they might be slower in terms of their learning. So to them, even though they go through the course, they may not be able to actually acquire the skills or to use the skills confidently. Okay. The next limitation, of course, when you are upgrading skills for existing workers, you also face some challenges. For example, you face resistance from the employers. Now, why do you think employers will resist sending their workers for training? Very simple, because training actually takes up time that could be spent on actually working. Okay, so what happens is that these employers would then lose the production from these workers while they go for training. Okay, so clearly as an employer, you don't want your workers to leave the job and just go on to training, and remember, you are actually still paying for their salaries during this training period. Okay. You're also worried that once these workers acquire this new set of skills, they become more in demand in the workforce, and therefore they may even leave once they get a better offer from another company. Okay, so what happens is then that you as an employer pays these workers' salaries while they are acquiring the new skills, but once they acquired the new skills, they move on to other companies in order to get better pay or better working conditions. Clearly then, if you are the employer, you lose out. Okay. Another bigger problem here is that these policies, they do not address cyclical unemployment. Okay. All these off-budget policy measures only address structural unemployment, and cyclical unemployment, it is due to economic downturn. These off-budget policies measures do not address the economic downturn. Okay, therefore, even though they are effective in reducing structural unemployment, it does not affect cyclical unemployment. Okay. So now you have presented both sides, and it is time for you to conclude. So here the conclusion is, of course, you can choose any stand that you want, but the stand that I'm going to present is that despite the many limitations, these off-budget policy measures that encourage retraining or acquiring of new skills is basically the only way for you to address the skills mismatch in the economy. Okay, there is no better way to do it. If there's a skills mismatch, you need to overcome this mismatch by training. Okay, and what is also important here is that these retraining policies need to be continually implemented, okay, in order to maximize its effectiveness. Meaning, I cannot just have training programs for 1 month, 1 year. Okay, it has to be continuous so that people always have the opportunity to upgrade themselves and acquire new skills. Okay. However, what the government can do perhaps is to provide even more financial assistance to the employers who send workers for retraining. So this would sort of reduce the burden on the employers when the workers are training for new skills, and therefore encourage them to be more forthcoming in terms of sending workers for retraining. Okay. So this basically will wrap up your answer to C part 1. Okay, now I move on to the C part 2, which is about a discussion of a wider implication of these off-budget policy measures on the Singaporean economy. So as usual, we start off with the question analysis. Now the command word here, basically you are asked to provide a discussion, so it is essentially discuss. Okay, and you notice for whether it is a discussion or evaluation, you still need to present both sides of the argument and then come to a stand. Okay, so the content here which you need to discuss on is basically the wider implications of these off-budget policy measures. Okay, another simpler word for implications is basically effects. Okay, so we are discussing on the different effects of these off-budget policy measures. So how do you break up into your two sides? Okay, I suggest that you talk about the negative and positive implications. Okay, so present the negative effects and positive effects. Okay, again, context, we are talking about the Singaporean economy. Okay, so moving on, what you want to do in the introduction is to present a very quick overview of the implications you want to talk about in your answer. Okay, so negative and positive implications, let me suggest negative implications will be then that there will be less resources to be spent on other areas, okay, and also that you may need to raise taxes in order to pay for all these training programs. The underlying assumption here, of course, is that these training programs need money, right? So if I need money, I need resources, and I need to be able to get resources, or at least to free up resources from other areas. Okay. The positive implications in the economic sense, basically what we are talking about here is if you have new skills, okay, if your workers have new skills, then in the long run it increases the productive capacity. And also not just economic implications but also social implications. The idea here is that if you are employed, okay, if most people are employed, then it tends to be that the social stability will also be improved. Okay, so again, you state your stand in the introduction. Of course, I leave it to you to choose your own stand, whether you think the negative implications outweigh the positive implications or the other way around. Okay, so let us present the negative implications first. So essentially what we are trying to say here, like I said just now, all these policy measures need money, and therefore if you choose to implement these policy measures, then there are opportunity costs involved. The idea here is that government resources are limited. So in order for you to fund these training programs, government funding in other areas like education may need to be reduced. Okay. Either that, or we may have to increase taxes in order to fund these programs. And we should now know that depending on what kind of taxes you implement, it would either affect the consumption component, C, or the investment component, which is I. Okay? And in addition, if it affects investment, then in the long run, your productive capacity will be affected. Okay? All these are the so-called negative implications for these off-budget policy measures. Basically, they center around the idea that these training programs need money, and where are you going to find the money, and what do you sacrifice in terms of other spending areas. Okay. Now for the positive implications, again, just now like I said in the introduction, I split it into the economic and the social implications. So for economic implications, basically you improve the opportunities for employment for the unemployed workers. So in a sense, you are reducing your structural unemployment. Okay, and more importantly, in the long run, when you have these retraining programs, you basically have a more skillful and efficient workforce. Therefore, the quality of your labor increases. Remember, labor is a factor of production, and when there is an improvement in the quality of labor, what happens is that your productive capacity in the economy actually increases. Okay, graphically, this would involve a rightward shift of your long run aggregate supply curve. Okay. Also, what happens here is that if you have new skills, okay, it means you are a more flexible workforce. You can do different job scopes. Okay. So it becomes easier for the economy to switch or progress from traditional kind of manufacturing-based economy to knowledge-based service and other high-tech industries. Okay? And apart from all this, if your quality of workforce is very high, it might also allow you to attract more foreign investment. Okay? All these factors actually improve the economic outlook of the country. Okay? Okay, the social implication here is basically that you reduce the social problems associated with unemployment. Okay? So like I said, the assumption here is with all these retraining programs, it becomes easier for you to become employed. Therefore, we would expect the unemployment rate to fall. So if unemployment rate falls, then social problems such as crime or any other negative social habits such as abuse of alcohol, abuse of drugs would then be reduced. Okay, and in a sense, having good quality jobs that takes advantage of newly acquired skills, it may reduce income inequality. Okay. The idea here, of course, is that with your new skills, you should get a job that is better paying. Okay, so if more people get higher paid jobs, then income inequality will be reduced. So taken as a whole, what is the benefit here? The benefit is then that we have greater social stability with more people being employed. Okay. So again, this is the social and economic implications that are positive for the economy and the country as a whole. Okay. So you have presented both sides. That is when you can conclude, and of course you conclude by restating your stand. And here the stand that I like to put forward is that the positive implications outweigh the negatives. Okay, so again, like I've said, you can choose to come up with your own stand. Here I'm going to take the stand that positive implications outweigh the negatives. Why? Because if you look at the negative implications, they are essentially cost related. Okay, that means that these are essentially one-off. Okay, once you pay for all these training programs, you will not face the negative implications anymore. Okay, and if you think about it, these training programs are not that expensive compared to the other forms of government spending that the government may incur each year. Okay, so to say that we have to reduce government spending in other areas or to raise tax in order to fund these retraining programs, it might be a little bit of an exaggeration. Okay, especially if you think from the Singaporean context when we quite regularly have budget surplus. Okay, if that's the case, we can easily fund all these retraining programs through the budget surplus. Okay, so the negative implications should not be too serious, at least in the Singaporean context. However, the positive implications can be felt even in the long run. Okay, so the idea here is that these positive economic and social implications actually lead to improvements in the economy and the lives of the workers that are actually quite long lasting. Okay, once you acquired a new skill, these skills stay with you for the rest of your lives. Okay, you cannot unlearn a skill. Okay, even if the skills eventually turns out to be obsolete, it may be something that happens only a few years later. Okay, so you may still enjoy quite a number of years of improvement in your standard of living through the acquiring of the skills. Okay, so ultimately again, you can choose to take a different stand from me. My stand that I have chosen is that the positive implications will outweigh the negatives, but what is more important is this few dot points here. Basically, how do you justify the stand that you have taken? Okay, so you have to be careful in terms of choosing your stand and then choosing the best way to justify your stand. Okay, so this is the video that goes through unemployment chapter, CSQ1 Parts C Part 1 and C Part 2. So I hope you enjoyed the video lectures, and hopefully if you like it, you can sound out to the rest of your tutors, and then we will see how else we can find ways to do up video tutorials for you guys. Okay, see you. Thank you very much.